I'm going to just throw out for a moment a set of test questions, right, about core beliefs. Do you think that every individual is equally worthy? Do you think that individuals should be free to join and leave groups at will, whether the group is a political group, a social group, a religious group, or the family? Do you think that human freedom is essentially about reforming oneself, figuring out what is really the best for your own life, no matter what your origins are, your history is, and who you came from? Do you think society should not interfere with the behaviors that you might find even reprehensible, so long as no one is directly harmed? Do you think that one human community is an ideal if only we could learn to live together? And do you think that reason and not love or faith should be the chief way that all political life is fashioned? Okay, that's a set of questions, but it gets at a large core of what we might call liberal political philosophy. Liberalism comes in many, many stripes and many, many variations. But none would put faith over reason in setting public norms. None would affirm that some individuals are less inherently worthy than others. And all would agree that individuals must be free to choose for themselves their own conception of what is a good life. And this last one is actually a linchpin if we want to get at the core of liberalism, because it is really based on the fundamental idea that personal autonomy is absolutely essential for humans to live a good life. So it turns out that many of these ideas that I have thrown out in the form of questions, many of them indeed can be accommodated with or even reflect conceptions within Judaism, even the most orthodox philosophies of Judaism. For example, the idea of freedom of choice, which implies that there ought to be no coercion in religion. So there are many Orthodox thinkers who would say the highest form of religious behavior is out of love and not fear, or the notion of Judaism as a voluntary association, which is actually what liberalism essentially demands of religions in the private sphere, that they be voluntary associations, because it's based on that idea of free entry and exit at will. Now, Judaism is a voluntary association. Judaism reorganized itself very successfully as a voluntary organization with the rise of nation states. And we can point to, from Mendelssohn to all versions of liberal Judaism, and we can even point, indeed, paradoxically, to Haredi life as a form of voluntary association, which is that the group is essentially composed of those who share a set of beliefs, including beliefs that are based on legal practices. But then we're eventually going to hit a wall. And when we really press the question whether Judaism, like liberalism, is at the core committed to the fundamental idea that personal autonomy is the basic value, we are going to have to rethink a little. So let me rephrase some of my questions. Do you think that Judaism somehow, in some way, promotes a sense of responsibility to the flourishing of other Jews that has some form of priority? Or is it utterly neutral as between Jews and others? Are you, in fact, neutral about Jews turning their backs on their family or their historical community, or their people, or intermarrying? Do you think ideally humans are one community? If we could just psychologically overcome our preference for being with similar people? Do you think that people should put aside their individual interests for the sake of certain collective goals? Should sacrifice be of value? So now all these questions hit on words that don't actually appear in most liberal philosophies. Those words are identity, solidarity, sacrifice, faith, and love. Those are the left-out words in liberal political philosophy. Although the Bible begins with a vision of shared humanity, the creation of everyone in the image of God, the narrative continues. And as the narrative continues, the sense one gets is that we are not, in fact, meant to have a universal human order. The prophets speak about living in peace with one another. But unlike John Locke, they don't speak about one human society and fellowship. Collectivities and separate peoples do not disappear. And the story of the Tower of Babel, in some ways, is a story of an attempt at a universal human order, and its remedy was the dispersal of people, their division into collectivities, different peoples with different languages. 2, sacrifice for the sake of core values and collective goals. The notion that there are some moral precepts, some transgressions, for which one should be killed rather than do, whatever they are. That's a substantive value. 3, a hierarchy of loyalty, social solidarity, responsibility, and therefore obligation that is dependent on criteria that are rather complex. It's not just Jew against non-Jew. It's the stranger in your gate or the poor in your town, but it is also your fellow Jew just because he is a fellow Jew. So, the liberal critique of Judaism can be put in general language. It is prone to divisiveness. It has some trouble with equality. And it isn't devoted to free entry and exit. And the Jewish critique of liberalism also can be put in general language. Basic human goods do not only come from being free in the sense of personal autonomy, but they come from a commitment to substantive moral values. They come from a life of meaning that presupposes a strong sense of identity and of culture, which only can come from living in smallish communities with a shared historical identity, the idea of suffering together, enjoying together, and hoping together, living in a community of trust. And finally, what it is to live in a social order that is framed around the concept of obligations, as opposed to a social order that's framed around the concept of rights. Obligations, when you're commanded at Sinai to do something, right? That core notion of Judaism means that everyone is addressed, not government. Everybody is key. And everybody has a sense of what it is that they owe to others as well as to themselves. And in order to frame it, it has to be specific, concrete, and have content. The language of rights is often empty, right? It's very powerful when it comes to restraining government, but it is not anywhere near as powerful as telling us exactly what our responsibilities are and what we owe to others. When I talk about Judaism, what I tend to emphasize is that it has a very particular intellectual grammar. And that intellectual grammar, it's to put complicated ideas in tension with one another to give each its due and not to try to synthesize them, but to work with both opposing sides, freedom and command, and work with them through the generations. Thank you.